Professor Chris Allee. First, let me introduce her in few seconds. Chris is an associate professor and chair in professional accounting at the University of Arkansas. He graduated from Indiana University with a PhD in accounting. Chris' research examines firm disclosure policy, textual analysis, and computational linguistics on firm disclosure, the productions and use of financial statement by small businesses, cost of equity capital estimates, and corporate tax policies and behavior. He has published research in the Accounting Review, Journal of Accounting Research, Contemporary Accounting Research, Review of Accounting Studies, Accounting Organization and Society, Management Science, the Journal of Management Accounting Research, Accounting Horizon, Business Horizon. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Chris Allee.
All right, thank you, Mohammed. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Good afternoon to those of you who are over there in Egypt and Africa and Europe, and good morning to everybody here in the US, and I guess good night to everybody who's over in China and Japan and Korea. I guess one of the cool things about the time that we currently live in is we have opportunities to meet like this in virtual settings. And I hope that everybody's healthy and well wherever you are. Today I'd like to present a little bit of my research, if that's okay. My research, as Mohammed had discussed, tends to talk about firm disclosure policies, the intersection of accounting information and capital markets. And so today I've chosen to prepare and present a couple papers that I'm particularly interested in getting your feedback on. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. The first paper that I intend to share with you is a paper called Product Market Competition, Disclosure Framing and Casting and Earnings Conference Calls. And my intention is to spend most of the time of our session on this paper. It is I guess one of my newer papers. I won't say it's my newest paper, but it's one of my newer papers, and it could use feedback. And so I'd like to spend time presenting this. I want to reserve the last 15 or 10 minutes of our time today to talk with you a little bit about another paper that I have on linguistic distance and firms' financial reports. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because of the very nature of this setting and this conference, this opportunity for us to meet together. I think this paper, the second paper, has some pretty interesting applicability. And so I wanted to share that with you. But I also wanted to let you know that I am going to, see, I practiced this morning. I'm going to take the chat screen and I'm going to put it on my other screen here. And so I'd like to, if at all possible, take questions as they come. And so as I'm presenting this paper, if you have questions about anything that we're doing, our theory, our methods, just want me to clarify something that we're up to in this paper, please feel free to just chat in the chat. Just say, hey, I have a question, and then I'll notice that this thing over here, the screen over here, is changing size, I guess is what it's going to be doing, and then I will go ahead and call on you. So please, again, feel free to unmute yourself once I've called on you, and then you can go ahead and ask me a question. So as I said, the paper that I want to start with is Product Market Competition, Disclosure Framing and Casting and Earnings Conference Call. This is a paper that's co-authored with Chung Do at University of Nevada and Mikhail Starin at Texas State. Both of these are young and promising scholars. They're great. I've been working with them for a little while now, and they are doing great work, and they do great work, and I'm grateful to be working with them on this project. So if you guys have had the opportunity to download the paper from SSRN or look at it, you know that basically this paper is looking at proprietary costs and how proprietary costs incurred through disclosure might affect those disclosures. That's kind of what we're trying to do. And basically the question is there an association between product market competition and disclosure tone, uncertainty, length, complexity, casting, and scripting? And the general premise behind this paper is actually pretty simple. Number one is if you decide to disclose, the first decision by far here, and it's a choice, I recognize that this is a choice that managers make, am I going to disclose? if managers decide to disclose, the next question has to be, what is that disclosure going to look like? And unfortunately, in our research, we tend to then go, in my opinion, to the minuscule details about that disclosure instead of looking at the big picture. And part of that is because that's the data that we have. We have the words, we focus on the words and the counts and those sorts of things. But Matt DeAngelis, a co-author of mine, we had published a paper a few years ago. We started what we thought was an interesting literature in the conference call literature, which is looking at a disclosure structure, a narrative structure. Now, again, we didn't start this literature. This literature has been around for a long time, especially in linguistics, but nobody had really looked archivally at these disclosures and how, if you look at a disclosure and you look at the structure of the disclosure, that's most likely the first decision that managers need to make on that disclosure. One of my favorite quotes is out of a paper, CEDOR 2002, where basically she notes that managers do not basically list off random facts about their earnings. They do not start an earnings conference call and just randomly choose what to share. Rather, managers choose how to structure their narrative to basically have causal orderings and concrete details that link the whole thing together. And so this paper is really trying to get back at that literature and try to say, okay, if you look at how a manager chooses to disclose, managers choose to disclose based on a narrative, based on a structure, based on a future outcome that they want. And we have a hypothesis that managers who face, as it says here, face product market competition, they might alter the structure or the tone or the uncertainty or the length or the complexity or these things of the call to meet a certain objective. And so that is kind of the underlying motivation behind our paper. And we believe that proprietary costs are a key element in looking at these disclosures. So why would proprietary costs be associated with disclosures? Well, there's a lot of research that suggests that proprietary costs influence managers' disclosure policy. Starting with Verrecchia in 1983, Verrecchia basically documents and shows that corporate disclosure policy is influenced and affected by proprietary disclosure, by proprietary cost of disclosure. And in this paper, basically, it's as simple as you could imagine that if you have to worry about proprietary costs, you just don't disclose. And so that is probably the first decision that managers have to worry about. Am I going to disclose or not? Once managers decide to start to disclose, now managers could disclose for a variety of reasons, and there's a ton of great research out here on this idea of volume of disclosure. When will a manager disclose versus when will she not disclose? And if we look at that research, it turns out that disclosure can be costly. And to share your firm policies, to share your firm forecasts, to do those sorts of things, it affects managers' ability to function in the future or to keep their job. But our question is, how then does competition, conditional on the decision to disclose, how does competition affect those disclosures? And so we're going to talk about framing, we're going to talk about casting, we're going to talk about scripting. Those are three different ways that we think, we hypothesize and we research and find that product market competition is going to affect those disclosures. Okay. And so that's kind of the underlying motivation behind our study. It starts with kind of the Verrecchia disclose or not disclose, and then it kind of goes to more of a behavioral literature and kind of a linguistic literature of, okay, if I have to share a message, if I have to report my earnings, which as we know is a pretty mandatory decision for publicly traded companies. So if I have to do that and I choose to have a conference call, which is a voluntary decision, how am I going to structure that conference call based on the information that I have and the information that I have to share? So ultimately, the first thing that we want to look at here is framing. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the framing literature, there is an entire literature out there that looks at how people want to share messages, okay? And so frames in thought, okay, you can think about like the way that you're trying to help other people think about whatever message that you're trying to share. You know, frames in thought are simple mental representations or interpretations or simplifications of the reality, the truth that is in fact going on. And so in this particular case, we are looking at earnings conference calls. And so a firm has a reality of their earnings. They earned X dollars per share. And if they earn that X dollars per share, then managers need to share that they earned X dollars per share. However, managers might choose to frame their X dollars per share in different ways to affect the interpretation of that information. And so one way that we view framing could be done is with positive or negative frames. And so again, no matter what, you still have X dollars per share to report, but you can frame that X dollars per share in different frames, in what you would call equivalent frame. In other words, no matter what, you still have X dollars per share, but you could change the representation of that in terms of the positive or negative speech that surrounds that. And so let's say that Sally has $10 per share and Betty has $10 per share, and they both want to share the $10 per share. Well, one person could say, hey, we earn $10 per share, and that means that next quarter we're going to earn more than $10 per share. And, you know, this $10 per share is an amazing number. Whereas another another manager, Betty, could say, hey, we earned $10 per share, and that was a hard $10 per share to earn. And there's a chance that we might earn more than $10 per share next quarter, but it's going to be really hard to increase that number. And again, while the numbers themselves are the same, and even the forecast of the future that of increasing earnings per share is the same, the way that the message is shared, that narrative really will affect, that rhetoric that is used will really affect the interpretation of the information. And so that's kind of the way that we look at framing in this study, is that even if you have the same information, hey, I beat expectations of the market, hey, I did better than I was expected, or I didn't do as good as I was expected, regardless of that information, that truth that is being shared, managers can choose to frame that message to affect the interpretation of the others. Now, we are looking at product market competition, and product market competition would suggest that I have to worry about how other people think about my business. In other words, if I think everybody else, if I don't want everybody else to think that they should come into my business, it is probably in my best interest to try and make and discourage others to enter. And so our hypotheses here are simply that if you have increasing product market competition, you will want to frame your message, you want to package it in a way with rhetoric and such that it will discourage people to enter and discourage people from wanting to be a part of what you're up to. And so that's kind of our first idea here, and that is that if there is if managers choose to do this, if managers choose to participate in disclosure framing, that they're going to try and change the message to try and discourage competition. Now, we also have a hypothesis associated with casting. And so casting is something that's somewhat new to the literature. So maybe some of you have never even seen it. I know when I first saw the Cohen et al. Paper came out, I thought it was a very interesting and very noteworthy project. This paper was recently published in 2020 in Management Science. So for those of you who are familiar with conference calls, you know that managers have a management prepared narrative, and managers will prepare what they have to say, and then they will take questions. Generally speaking, those questions are somewhat known beforehand. The managers kind of know what they're going to be getting from their analysts. And Cohen et al. Have a nice study where they basically say that if managers want to shape the message, if they want to shape the information environment of the call, then they will call on only certain analysts, that they will specifically call on bullish analysts, which are analysts that are positive on the company. And the way that they hypothesize this is if managers are worried about current or future performance, if they're worried about, I guess, tough questions and questions that will affect the interpretation, again, this idea of the information of the call and how you're trying to structure it so you get the message out that you want as a messenger as a manager to be shared. Cohen all basically suggests that managers will cast their conference calls. And what this basically means is I'm going to call on analysts that have the message that I want. And so what they do is they look at analysts who have really strong positive forecasts for the company. And it turns out that Cohen et al. Find that managers will call on the positive and the bullish analysts when they have the potential to have maybe future problems or even current problems with the financial reports and performance. We, in our hypothesis, obviously think that this is an interesting setting because we have the opposite prediction for firms facing high product market competition. That is, Cohen et al. Find a setting, and actually some of the prior researchers found that managers will choose select analysts, all-star analysts, friends, associates. They will choose analysts that they want to call on, but there has been no research that we're aware of that looks at when managers might have incentives to call on the bearish analysts, the analysts with maybe the most negative questions or with the least positive outlooks for the firm. And so we here examine casting as firms facing high product market competition and whether or not they're going to call on the pessimistic analysts in terms of the ordering of the call first, and how much time are they going to take answering pessimistic questions, again, with this idea of a nuanced and subtle way of shaping the information that is being shared in that call. In terms of the last examination that we have, that needs more description and more presentation from me, because it's not just the length of the script and the number of words and those sorts of things, is this idea of scripting. And so Josh Lee in 2016 in his dissertation, he basically looked at the degree to which managers will choose to script their responses. Now, again, going back, this is a conference call. In a conference call, you have a management prepared narrative. Managers prepare words and statements and facts and all these sorts of things. And then after they're done with that, there's a Q&A section. And so, in the prior analysis with casting, we look at the analyst questions themselves and managers' responses to those questions. But now we're talking about just management's responses. And so the idea behind Lee 2016 is that if managers don't want to share additional information, again, if they want to keep the information environment somewhat closed off, managers will only respond to analyst questions with prepared scripts, and specifically that those scripts will be based on the management prepared narrative. They will stick very close to the message that they shared in the management prepared narrative. And so we look at this in this setting, which is product market competition. When firms are facing high product market competition, do we observe that there's an association between high product market competition and managers' choice to stick to the script, to stick closer to that script? And again, the idea is if you are facing high product market competition, the number one decision is you probably don't want to disclose. But managers have to disclose their earnings. Most managers facing the markets today will choose to do a conference call. Well, why would they do a conference call? Well, the answer is simple. No matter what, I'm going to have to share my earnings. And if I'm going to have to share my earnings, why not share it based on my own script? Why not share it based on my own message? And so if we're going to do a conference call, maybe we want to script the answers to the Q&A section in times of high product market competition. So that's basically the motivation, the underlying motivation behind our study. Within this framework, if you had an opportunity to look at the paper, and I hope you did, and I hope you have questions about the paper as well, one of the problems that we face in our study is the fact that competition has its own economic effects. And what I mean by that is, if I'm a firm and I am facing high product market competition, that might affect the underlying economics of my firm. In other words, competition affects the economics, specifically the profitability, position, and risk of my company. And if that's the case, then there is a direct effect of competition on these disclosures from product market competition. Now, we do a lot of fun econometric and other things to try and control for that. We try to come up with what we would consider abnormal tone. That is tone outside of the firm's performance, position, and risk. That's what we think we're finding with our tone and our uncertainty results. But we certainly acknowledge in the paper that tone and uncertainty especially could be associated with product market competition. So if that is the case, then how can we look at our hypothesis of product market competition and its effect on framing and casting and scripting? Well, one of the great benefits of the casting and the scripting analyses are, if you think about casting especially, the prior research suggests that managers will want to cast their calls in a positive light. The Cohen et al. Study basically shows that when managers are facing high product market, when they are not high product market competition, they don't look at that. But when managers are facing tough times, when the economics are tough, that they will actually want to call on the bearish analysts, the bullish analysts. They want to call on the positive analysts. They want to, focus on the good and have analysts bring that out, the positivity. But obviously managers in high product market competition have different incentives. They might want to focus on different analysts and again have that discouraging effect of competition that we suggest in the paper. And so one of the cool settings that we think we have here is that, especially with the casting and the scripting results, that we have the opportunity to distance ourselves from the direct effects of competition and look at this indirect effect, the discouraging effect, the discouraging hypothesis we suggest in the paper, specifically here. So that gets to our hypotheses. And so as I've already suggested, I know I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but disclosure is going to impose costs. If we disclose, if we're going to say anything, it's going to have costs. There are benefits, of course, as well, and those benefits could be examined here too. We think we do a lot in our paper, and so we think we're doing enough for the paper, but we're going to look at these proprietary costs and say, okay, if this disclosure imposes proprietary costs on firms, then firms in more competitive markets are going to want to, first of all, avoid disclosure. And you're going to see we do a volume. The literature tends to have a lot of these volumes or disclose or non-disclose binary decisions. And so we do that too. That hasn't really been shown in a conference call setting, so that's a contribution of our paper. But if we do disclose, then we're going to have to be careful. And we're going to have to structure our message such that the tone and the uncertainty might be trying to discourage competition. That is, managers will want to project some degree of variability in tone and uncertainty to try and structure that message so as to discourage competitors. And so that is what our hypothesis is. H1 is product market competition is associated with increasingly pessimistic tone and uncertainty in conference calls. So that's our first hypothesis. In terms of the second hypothesis, we believe that managers who face high levels of product market competition will want to call on the bearish analysts earlier. Kind of this idea of ordering, it sets the tone of the call. If the first analyst and the second analyst ask negative questions, then that kind of sets the tone of the call, and so that managers facing high levels of product market competition will want to call on those negative analysts. Now, again, I believe, and we as researchers, Mikhail and Chung, we believe that this is noteworthy because the direct effects of competition would suggest that managers want to focus on the positive, on the bullish analysts, because Cohen et al. Show that in situations where the future is more uncertain, in the situations where the future is more questionable, whether we're going to meet or beat next quarter's or next year's analyst expectations, we're going to focus on the positive and the bullish analysts. That's what Cohen et al. Finds. However, they didn't, of course, look at our particular setting, which is when managers face high product market competition, they might have differing incentives. And so we believe that the discouraging effect that we hypothesize or propose would result in product market competition being associated with the casting of pessimistic analysts in the earnings calls. And so that is our second hypothesis. Fantastic. So what's the methodology that we use here? We use, I guess I would say, state-of-the-art methods. Luckily for us, we have access to a lot of data, and that data provides for us a lot of opportunities to do textual analysis. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the textual analysis literature, for years, we as researchers have tended to focus on the numbers. We're accountants, we're finance people. We tend to focus on the numbers, of course. But recently, a lot of research has suggested that the message that surrounds those numbers, the text that surrounds those numbers, the actual reports and the words in those reports themselves can be very, very helpful for us to use and to analyze. And so that is kind of what we chose to do here, is to do that. Do we have a question? I just heard somebody unmute themselves. Does somebody have a question? Maybe they just accidentally unmuted themselves. Okay, so what we do here is we use a text-based classification measure called the total similarity score. That's from the Hoberg and Phillips 2016 paper as our proxy for competition. And I think this is one of the really interesting parts of our paper. For years, we in accounting and finance, particularly, chose to think about competition as concentration. And that is, we're used to these things called Herfindahl indexes, and we look at how concentrated an industry is. And we thought basically that industry competition and concentration were the same thing. But Hoberg and Phillips did a really nice job in 2009 and going forward to try to really help us understand from a textual analysis perspective of the difference between concentration and competition. And basically what they did is they took a firm's accounting reports, and in their accounting reports they talk about their business, their lines of business and what they do. And what they did is they compared the textual properties, the uniqueness, I guess you could say, of one firm's accounting report to everybody else's. And then they did it again and again for all firms that are putting their reports out there for us to see on the Edgar database. And by doing this, basically you get an idea of how stiff a competition a firm faces based on how similar one company is to another in terms of what they say that they do. And so Hoberg and Phillips did a lot of this associated with mergers and acquisitions. You can see this paper that looks at product market synergies and competition in mergers and acquisitions, text-based analysis by Hoberg and Phillips. And, so they looked at whether or not mergers were really kind of mergers within the same industry or the same, whether or not you're merging competitors or whether you're not merging a competitor. And by doing so, they came up with, again, this measure that we're focused on here, which is the total similarity score, which is how similar are companies in their business processes. And here's the later version of that same paper, where they have an example here of Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Antheon, and the different competition measures that they have there. And so ultimately, that's what we use as our proxy for competition. Again, for those of you who are new, I know a lot of you are doctoral students who are attending this seminar. You'll notice in the literature that there's a significant shift after Hoberg and Phillips on looking at competition and how we now kind of understand better the difference between competition and concentration. And so we use the total similarity score from Hoberg and Phillips as our measure of product market competition. As I already told you earlier, we also do an analysis that follows along with the literature that frankly we're not all that interested in, because we think we know what the answer is going to be, and certainly we did find what the prior literature had all found. But we chose for the completeness of our project to just do an analysis on whether or not a firm chooses to disclose or not, and whether or not that is associated with product market competition. As I alluded to earlier in my presentation on the motivation section, here, let me just quickly go back to that. You can see here, again, there have been plenty of studies that show that proprietary costs are associated with the incidence, the volume, the binary decision, disclose or not disclose. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that. And so, again, this is just an analysis that we chose to do to kind of follow along with the literature. And so what we did is we created a variable, earnings call, which is an adjusted indicator variable about whether or not you're going to show up in our sample of earnings calls or not. And the hypothesis here is pretty simple. If you face high product market competition, you're less likely to do an earnings call. And again, the reason is you don't want to share any additional information. You especially don't want to face those analyst questions. You don't want them asking you about your company and having to disclose something that you don't want to disclose. And so ultimately, we do a 1-0 analysis of whether or not you do an earnings call or not. That's our disclosure volume test, and the first test that we do. Getting into the stuff that we really are interested in, the focus of our study, and these are the start of our framing tests. So we hypothesize that firms facing high product market competition will try to frame their message in a more negative and uncertain light so as to ward off competition. And so what we do here is we look at tone and uncertainty. Tone is measured as we measure tone, which is the number of positive words minus the number of negative words divided by the total word count. And so the more pessimistic the message, the more negative this tone measure is. In terms of uncertainty, luckily for us, there have been a lot of researchers that have created bag of words. And what's a bag of words? A bag of words is a set of words that have a particular context or message. And in this case, it's uncertainty. Prior researchers have come along and found a bunch of words to be uncertain words. And so we take and we count the number of uncertain words in a text, and we divide that by the total words, and that gives us the degree of uncertainty that managers are using in their message to frame that message around the firm's performance, position, and risk, of course, the underlying performance, but also in terms of how they want to frame it around product market competition, which is our hypothesis and our interest here. In terms of casting, I already described this a little bit to you, but we do, I would say our analyses on casting is we follow after Cohen, but we don't do the same test that they do. And so here are the three things that we've chosen to do in terms of casting a call. Towards the back of the call, Cohen et al. Look at the ordering that managers choose to look at bullish versus bearish analysts, and they hypothesize that managers will choose bullish, positive analysts first. Again, that's kind of an analysis at the back of their paper, and that's where we start with our analysis. We say, okay, well, again, if you're trying to structure this message, and if you're trying to focus on the more pessimistic elements of the firm's performance so as to ward off product market competition and keep that frame that you're looking for, the structure that you're looking for, we hypothesize that you are going to the first analyst that you call on is going to have an unfavorable question, a negative pessimistic question. And so that's our first measure, just a 1-0 of whether or not the first analyst that you call on is unfavorable. The next question is cast half, which is the proportion of questions in the first half of the Q&A section that are unfavorable. Again, the idea is, okay, we're in the first part of our Q&A, we're going to want to focus on those unfavorable questions so as to set the message that we're looking for. And then the last one is the cast focus measure, which basically looks at, okay, now that we've called on these analysts, thinking about the totality of analyst questions, managers have a decision. They have a decision on whether or not to focus on the unfavorable questions and whether to spend a lot of time answering them. And so we look at the total unfavorable word count relative to the total word count, and we examine whether or not managers focus on those negative questions, on those unfavorable questions in their responses. And so those are our casting variables that we look at and the measures that we focus on for that analysis. And then the last of all, again, this is taken directly from the Lee measure. We follow Lee 2016, where what we're going to do is we're going to looking at the scripting of the Q&A, and how we do this is we look at the cosine similarity between the vector of function words, and this is the vector of unique function words. What you basically do is you take all the words that are in the management prepared narrative, and you look at the unique ones, and then we take a vector of words and these function words that are in the management's responses in the Q&A, and we see how similar they are. And the idea behind this is pretty simple, and that is, if managers use the same exact words in the Q&A as they did in the prepared narrative, they are clearly trying to stick to a script, that they're trying to make everything very, very similar and restrict the information environment. And so basically what we do is we follow Lee by doing that. And then, of course, one of the problems is the different lengths in the management prepared narrative as well as managers' responses. And so to account for that, what you do is you regress the lengths of the prepared remarks and the responses in the Q&A section and use the residuals. And so that's kind of where we have here with the script Q&A measure. Script Q&A is higher when manager responses are more scripted. So in other words, the more scripting that they do, the higher this measure is going to be. We hypothesize that managers facing high product market competition will want to be more scripted. They want to close down that information environment. And so we expect a positive association here for our analysis. So that is the basic methodology underlying scripting and casting and our framing. So finally, something that I mentioned earlier is this idea of the direct effect of competition on firms. And, again, this is a hard thing for us to deal with, especially in the framing analyses. With the other two analyses, we believe that the discouraging effect is easier to see just because the results would be different under the direct effect, we believe. But for the discouraging effect especially, we think that, for the framing analyses especially, we have to be careful. We have to be careful with the underlying economics of the firm and how product market competition might affect them. And so what we do is we choose to do a matching analysis. For those of you who are following along with the accounting literature, we have really fallen in love with matching. Matching is something that we do a lot in our papers, in our analyses. And so what we chose to do is we chose to match firms. We take a high competition sample, a low competition sample, and what we're going to try and do is find a high competition firm and a low competition firm that have the same underlying uncertainty or volatility. Because the idea behind this is, okay, well, if this is, if what we're finding is because of the nature of the firm, in other words, the volatility, the uncertainty of the firm, well, then we're not finding what we think we're finding. And so what we're going to try and do is find firms that are equally uncertain, but one with high product market competition, the other with low product market competition, and just try and see whether or not we continue to observe the association that we are looking for. And so that's kind of where we're at with the matching analyses. One last note, I put this slide in here particularly because, again, when I talked with Mohammed about doing this seminar, I know this seminar is often focused on PhD seminars and doctoral students who are still, trying to learn how to do research, and especially accounting research. And so I wanted to point out this paper by Chen et al. So for years in accounting research, we've done something that is somewhat questionable, and that is to run a regression, take the error from that regression, and then go ahead and put that as a dependent variable, left-hand side variable in a future regression. And so again, anybody who's familiar with the earnings management research in accounting knows that what we tend to do is we tend to go along and we run a regression and say, okay, well, I want to get the residual from a regression that looks at things like accruals and get that residual. And then what I'm going to do is that is going to be my dependent variable for future regressions. So in 2018, Chen et al. Published a paper, I believe it's in JAR, that basically says that has some problems. And so when we were first doing this analysis, thinking about the framing analysis, think about tone, for example, there's a really nice paper in TAR published in the Accounting Review by Huang et al. that look at this thing called abnormal tone. And so one thing we thought we might need to do was basically look and see whether or not abnormal tone is associated with product market competition. In other words, run a first stage regression, get the residual, then take that residual and put it on the left-hand side and put product market competition there and see if there's the association that we expect. But the Chen et al. Paper suggests that that's really not a great way to go about doing things. And so instead, what you should do is just include all the variables you would have in a first stage regression and put them all in there and just run just one regression. And so I just want to note that for those of you who are out there doing research today, and especially if you're doing earnings management research with residuals, just pay attention to this paper. We're trying to do it the right way. We're trying to do it to the post-Chen world where we're having one regression. And certainly we could run an abnormal tone regression and take that abnormal tone measure and put it on the left-hand side. But the reason why we don't is because we feel like the Chen et al. Paper suggests that that's not the right way to do it. And so FYI, if you wonder why our primary measure isn't abnormal tone instead of tone itself, the answer is because we're trying to do this kind of in a one-stage process, one-stage method there. So what do we find? Before we get to the tables, I have the tables so we can look directly at the results. I wanted to just kind of summarize the results. So as we hypothesized, we found that product market competition is negatively associated with a firm's decision to host these earnings calls. So again, that is not a surprising result. I think nobody's really ever shown it in an earnings conference call setting, but we find that product market competition is negatively associated with the firm's decision to do an earnings conference call. And that is the 1-0, disclose or not disclose. Varecki would say, don't disclose. We find that firms don't disclose. Now, in terms of tone, we find increasingly negative, less positive tone in earnings conference calls in both the management prepared narrative and the Q&A section for firms facing high product market competition. Now, again, we think this is an interesting result. It is very, very similar to a result that was published recently by Burks et al. Burks et al. Have a really nice analysis. In the Burks et al. Paper, they look at whether or not disclosure is associated with competition in a banking setting. They look at banks and they find, again, that banks are less likely to disclose in high product market competition. And then they do a tone analysis towards the end of their paper, and we find very similar to their results that the tone is increasingly negative in the face of high product market competition. Now, again, we have a different setting. We're looking at earnings conference calls. We have an MPN and a Q&A. We look at things differently than they do, but we are able to kind of replicate their result in our setting. And then we also find that the length of management's responses, and this is kind of an additional analysis in our paper towards the end, that the length of management responses to analyst questions in the Q&A is shorter when facing high product market competition, which is, again, that idea of, hey, if I don't want to share something, I don't want to disclose, or I want to make my disclosure shorter. So those are all in line with our hypotheses. In terms of product market competition being positively associated, we find that product market competition is positively associated with uncertainty in earnings calls, which is novel to our paper. In other words, managers are more uncertain when they face high product market competition, and we find that result in both the management prepared narrative and the Q&A. We find that managers are more likely to cast pessimistic analysts in the Q&A when facing high product market competition. Again, that is relatively novel to our paper. Scripting of managers' responses in the Q&A, we find that managers are more scripted when they face higher levels of product market competition, which we believe contributes to the Lee 2016 study. And then finally, if you got to the end of our paper, at the very last part of our paper, we decided in a completely different venue, which is, think about a company's 10K reports, their annual reports, and in a completely different type of framing, which would be complexity. We found that managers in their 10Ks or more complex have increasingly higher complexity in the face of product market competition, which we believe is just more evidence of our framing hypothesis. Okay, as you can see throughout the paper, we try to add economic magnitudes of these things, and generally speaking, for the tone and the uncertainty results, we find a 3 to 5% increase in pessimistic and uncertainty through the MP and the Q&A. For the casting of calls, we see a 2% difference in the methods that they do these things. So we believe that, again, the economic magnitudes aren't giant, but we do believe that we have economic magnitudes that are interesting, I guess, that are significant enough to talk about.
Hey, Chris.
Yes, question.
Hey, this is John.
Hey.
I was wondering about the quantitativeness of the disclosure. Did you
Sure.
look at that at all? Because I worked for a company, of course, that had these issues that had product market competition, and we intentionally wanted to remove the numbers that we disclosed. We wanted to be more vague, like we would answer a question without specificity. And so I don't know if that's something you could look at or would be interested in.
No, John, that's a great idea. We have not looked at the use of numbers. Matt and I in another project have looked at that before. So that's one of the nice things, again, for the people who haven't done textual analysis. You only have so many levers you can pull, but the number of numbers is one of those levers you can pull. And I think that's a really good idea. So basically the idea, John, was that if you, and I guess it kind of goes along with the uncertainty stuff we find, right? Like numbers are pretty certain. And so if you're going to face high product market competition, you just don't want to talk about the number of things that you sold or the number, in terms of quantities.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
like
I can show you an anecdote from a conference call script where the CFO says, "I'm not going to build your model for you," and he was basically saying like, I have competition. I don't want everybody to know. So, yeah, exactly what you just said.
Yeah, I like that. We haven't looked at that, but again, part of me says, like, do we really want to add another analysis on here just because we
Maybe
have all
not.
these things,
Maybe
right?
not.
No.
Yeah.
No, but I think it would fit really well. Whenever somebody suggests something on you're trying to think of how it fits in your paper. And right now we have an additional analysis towards the end, right? Where we look at length and we looked at scripting. And, John, it's almost like it's built for another column right there, right? It just seems like there would be a really nice column that say like, we look at uncertainty words, but another way to look at certainty is to just look at the sheer numbers. So yeah, I like that. Thank you for that suggestion. Yeah. By the way, John, just since you're the first person to participate yet, did you try like letting me know you had a question in the chat, or did you just unmute yourself?
I just unmuted myself.
Okay.
I've seen other people raise hands, so you might want to, yeah.
Oh,
anyway.
I haven't seen hands raised. See, that's the problem. Okay, my apologies. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask me before I keep going on with the results?
Yes, please. I have a question actually, Chris.
My apologies for not seeing the hands raised and the questions. I've been looking at the chat and I've been seeing people joining and leaving the meeting, but I haven't seen any questions. So go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm just wondering, actually, the underlying theoretical foundation behind the paper so far is product market competition. But it seems to me that you ruled out all the other motivations behind the manager's decision to manage or to have discretionary power over the tone of the disclosure itself because of the agency problem or agency theory kind of, or obfuscation tendency or the psychological nature of the manager itself to be over pessimistic. So far, all what I can see that the driving behind the call for the conference calls and the casting and the framing is basically the economic factor of the product market competition. I'm fully aware that the product market competition is actually a rival to the agency theory itself because it's a market discipline to the manager's behavior. So I'm not quite sure how did you control that in the analysis so far. Is it it's going to be in the statistical analysis later by controlling for that one? And this is one question out of 3, please. So if you allow me to ask the 3 questions, but I'm gonna wait for the answer for this one, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, I'll turn it back over to you. So, so obviously there's a lot of reasons why managers will do conference calls, and that is one of the hardest things for us to deal with. And again, I think you have a lot of good thoughts here that, hey, there are a lot of different strategies. If I understand your question correctly, there's a lot of different strategies. Conditional on us choosing to do the call, we could use obfuscation as a method of trying to, do this, or we could use, whatever it is, tone as we look at. Agency theory would suggest that we want to keep our jobs, and so we're going to disclose certain things and not disclose other things. But we do try to empirically mostly control for this with later controls. And again, as you look at our regressions, they're significantly, they're lengthy, they're long. If there's anything that you think we need to control for to help with agency theory, with obfuscation theory, with any of those other things, please do let me know. We'd love to throw it in there. Obviously, we want this paper to get published, and so if there's any of those Z's, if you know the V's and Z's, if you know any of those other variables that we need to be controlling for, please do let me know. But yeah, we do not think that the primary motivation for an earnings conference call, or even tone or uncertainty within an earnings conference call, is product market competition. We think it's kind of a second order effect that after you have to announce your earnings, we know you have to announce your results, we know you have to try to keep your job as a manager. All of those things are, you have to please investors, and especially institutional investors. All of those things are factors in your call. But what we're suggesting is, once you take care of all of that package, product market competition is something that also affects the framing, casting, and the scripting of conference calls. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
It really helps, and probably I'm sorry I didn't have the time to read the paper itself. Probably when I see the regulation in your presentation, that will help me to frame what did you control for. So, but
yeah,
you'll
see we have a lot of controls, and then of course we do the matching analysis as well. So again,
okay.
I hope you'll be pleased with the number of variables.
I'm sure I will. Another question, please. That you mentioned that, and I can see that you measured the tone by the wording list, the positive tone minus the negative tone divided the total numbers. There is a kind of criticisms against the using that particular format because the word list itself is actually have many words for the negative tone and very few words for the positive tone, and that itself have an implication to the measurement of that particular variable when it comes to the linking the product market competition to the pessimistic disclosure. So I'm not quite sure how did you manage to manage those number of words in those lists, or did you address this particular issue when you had your analysis?
Okay, so one of my first papers in textual analysis is a tone paper, obviously tone dispersion paper that was published in 2015 that I with Matt DeAngelis. But I will be honest, ever since then I've been really down on tone. I've been really pessimistic on the tone literature, and one of the reasons is because of what you said, right? The word list that we have for positive and negative tone are so disparate that it's really hard to kind of fix that. Now, what I would say is that we have, we look at uncertainty, we look at length, we look at casting, and so we have a ton of additional analyses. One of the reasons why we're doing tone is just because everybody will expect us to do tone. But I 100% agree that, and by the way, as I've already mentioned, Burks et al. Already do tone. Burks 2018, they already do tone. And so we're really just doing it to kind of be more complete in our research study. But ultimately, whoever chooses to do analyses with textual analysis using tone is going to face this, because it turns out that I don't know whether we as a people are just really negative, right? But as you said, like there's just a different number of negative words relative to positive words that managers can use. And so we are beholden to the word list, the bag of words that we use. And your comment is completely true in terms of analyses that choose to do tone. And there's nothing, honestly, that we can really do about it. There's just nothing. So.
Thank you for this, but can I go for one last question, please?
Oh, of course, yeah, sure. I apologize. I had no idea that people had questions. I thought they just.
I was raising my hand since the beginning. I thought it would be better not to interrupt you while you are doing your presentation.
No, I prefer to take questions. I thought just
that's
nobody.
What you mentioned, yeah,
I thought nobody found my study interesting, so I was a little bit worried for a while. So I'm glad that you have questions.
No worries at all, Chris. One final question from my side so far. Well, I can understand that the unit of analysis for the framing was actually the word where you measure the tone. But when it comes to the casting, you started to talk about the questions and the answers. So the unit of analysis here was actually the tone of the question itself or the tone of the word in the question. So I'm not quite sure. So how did you measure? Well, when you say that question, when you operationalize that particular casting, I think you talked about first the question is a more of negative, or first half of the questions is going to be like more of negative. So I'm not quite sure. Are you addressing the sentence itself, which is framing the question, or a word inside the question? I get confused in the slides about it.
Yeah, my apologies. So I as you can see,
my apologies. Probably my confusion is mine. I just need a clarification from my side. So.
Yeah, you're good. So I went back to the slide. And so basically what we do is we take every question and we label it. Is it an unfavorable? Well, one of three labels. Is it an unfavorable? Is it a favorable? Or is it a neutral question? Okay. And how we do that is based on the tone dictionaries. And again, we've already talked about the problems with tone dictionaries. But basically what we're saying is, are analysts positive? Are they negative? Or are they, not toned in their question?
So basically, you use the question itself as a sentence, a unit of analysis. So the sentence.
That is exactly right. Yeah. And so the first measure is just basically, is the first question a negatively toned question? Is it an unfavorable question? Right. Yeah. What is the percentage of negatively toned questions? But yes, exactly. The unit of observation here is the questions. And then the reason why I went back to the slide, the third analysis, we were worried about doing that which is using the question itself as the unit of analysis. And so then what we did is we focused on managers, we call it cast focus. We look at managers' responses. And the way that I think about this, right, is ultimately managers have a lot of strategies here. And one of their strategies is if they want to bring up more uncertainty and bring up more negativity, that when an analyst asks a question that's in line with what they want the underlying framing of the message to be, they can just spend more time on that question, right? And so that's why we look at cast focus, which is the length of management response to unfavorable questions. So one strategy, of course, would be for managers, if you get a negative question, just to answer it quick and get out of there, right? But we say in the face of high product market competition, you want to spend more time there because that's more in line with the message that you want to share. Does that make sense?
It makes very much sense.
Okay.
And thanks very much. Thanks much, Chris, for
thank you for your questions. I appreciate it.
And really very promising paper. Really, I'm really enjoying hearing this paper today. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Anybody else? Now we're on a roll. Anybody else have any questions they want to ask of me before we get to the results?
Yeah, hi, Chris.
Hi.
Yeah, it's to my understanding that you argue that managers manage their tone or disclosure in order to avoid or minimize the competition cost. Yeah, if this is true, so I think doing this by showing negative or pessimistic tone or showing uncertainty is also have a cost. So if you argue this is because managers doing this to manage managing their disclosure to minimize cost, also I think providing pessimistic tone or uncertainty also will have a cost. So how can you interpret this challenging if my point of view is true?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. This is one of my more favorite questions to answer on our project.
Yeah.
I love to put what I call my manager hat on, right? I love to put this on and say, okay, I want to keep my job. So I can't go out there and just be negative and uncertain, right? Like that's something I can't do. Additionally, I've been dealt a set of cards, right? I've been dealt a hand, and that's the hand that I have to play, right? Again, I might have a full house, I might have a pair of twos, but that is the message that I have to share. And so the first thing, and I hope this is certainly more in the paper than my presentation, as I think about the words that I've said in the past. I haven't done a good enough job of saying, like, listen, managers have to announce their earnings. They have to announce things as they are. Like, hey, we had $10 per share. We met our expectations. We have these new products coming out. Those are the things they have to say. What we're trying to say here, and part of the problem with this is because we're trying to follow the Chen et al. Paper, which doesn't allow us to use an abnormal tone measure. But what we're trying to say is after you deal with the actual earnings of the firm, after you deal with the fact that, sales went up, after you deal with the fact that research and development costs were too high, after you deal with all of these other things that managers have to do, on balance, if you're thinking about that messaging, on balance, that the residual tone for firms that have high product market competition will be more negative, because while we want to let the world and our investors know that we earn $10 per share and we want to keep our jobs because we met analyst expectations, we don't want our competitors to think, wow, that is such a profitable business. We want to jump in there and take all their profit margins. One of my favorite studies that has been done, I kind of grew up, Jim Whalen is my dissertation chair, and I grew up in the financial statement analysis kind of arena, right? And if you look at that arena, one of the things that you learn very quickly from firms and their value and how firms keep their value is it turns out that if you look at return on assets, specifically return on net operating assets, and you decompose it into asset turnover and profit margin, it's really hard for firms to keep their profit margins. our research has shown that basically the only way to stay profitable in the long run is to have good asset turnovers, right? Profit margins will erode. And the reason why profit margins will erode is because competitors see your high profit margin and they come in and they take them, right? And so I think, one thing that if I was a manager, I have to report my earnings. I have to report those things, but I don't want the world to take giant notice of how high my profit margins are or how well our company is doing, because the more I do that, the more likely competitors are going to come in and steal it, right? And so thank you for your question, because again, my answer is simple. I know it's been long, but my answer is simple. On balance, when managers face high product market competition, as John said earlier, John Campbell, thanks for stepping in and helping me with my paper. If you face a lot of competition, you're just going to be careful with what you say. And again, remember, this is nuanced and it's subtle and it's residual. But what our hypothesis is that residual tone is going to be negative. That residual uncertainty is going to be positive, right? That residual, are we going to ask this analyst a question, in terms of the casting analysis? We're going to maybe lean towards the negatives, because ultimately we want to protect our product margins, and our information. Does that make sense as an answer? I hope when we go through and do the results, I can show you that we try to control for all the things that you're talking about, the primary responses. Does that make sense as an answer to your question? I might have spoke too long. He left.
Chris, I had a similar concern about, can you really control for all those things? But I think you can. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me again, because so I work for Remington, as you know. Our biggest issue wasn't being negative per se, but it was if we talked too much about what our production schedule was going to be like if we talked too much about what expected demand would be like, or expected supply from our customers, then we felt like this would open exactly what you said. Our competitors would take advantage of knowing what we were doing when we didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
And that's the real thing, is that it's like, it's a game, like you said, where you're holding your cards close to the chest, and you don't want to be the one to let your card down and have everyone else still holding their cards close.
Yeah, and that's why I love our casting results. It's kind of new to our paper, right? But ultimately, I mean, the research has shown that managers will try to focus on, again, to keep their jobs and to keep investors happy, will tend to focus on the positive, right? We're showing, again, a statistically significant difference in firms facing higher product market competition, not looking for that extra boost, you would say, of doing the casting like we'd expect, which I find it to be pretty interesting. But thanks, John, for helping me out there. I appreciate that. Any other questions before I finish with the results and then go on to my quick, as I said, I wanted to take 10 or 15 minutes, so we should have enough time to go to the other paper. Anybody else have any questions? Awesome. So in terms of the results, I already kind of went over this slide, talked about the economic magnitudes that we're finding. Additionally, as I noted earlier, I believe, actually I don't think I did, when we look, do these analyses, one of the things that we look at, an additional analysis we do, is we look at the forward-looking statements. And when we're looking at forward-looking statements of tone and uncertainty, that's primarily where we're finding our results. So it's pretty cool. So to go over quickly the results, the first table, table 4, as I said, we expect that firms that face higher product market competition are less likely to just do earnings calls. This is kind of the Verrecchia stuff, and that's what we find. Firms are less likely to do earnings calls if they face higher product market competition. That's not a very surprising result. Table 5 finds that firms facing high product market competition are more negative and more uncertain. right? More pessimistic and uncertain. And earlier I got a question about controls. As you can see, we try as best as we can to control for earnings management, for the size of the firm, for the age of the firm, for the performance, where is the earnings surprise, for the, the performance of the firm. Of course, if you are a firm and you have a positive earnings surprise, generally the tone is going to be positive. But what we're talking about kind of, again, is this residual abnormal tone associated with product market competition. And so that's kind of the difference in our setting, is we're not trying to do a two-stage analysis where we have a residual abnormal tone measure. Rather, what we're trying to do is say this abnormal tone is negative relative to all the other reasons why you might have positive tone or negative tone. The residual tone is more negative for firms that face higher product market competition, and more uncertain for firms that face higher product market competition. That's kind of what we're doing with our Table 5 analysis. Table 6 is our casting analysis. Once again, we have a bunch of controls in here for casting, and we find that firms, whoops, I went the wrong way. Firms that face higher product market competition are more likely to cast their calls, but cast their calls in a very unique way, a way that frankly the literature hasn't ever documented that I'm aware of. And that is, they call on the bearish analyst, on the pessimistic analyst first. They are more likely to have the first half of analyst questions being negative, and then they spend a little bit, certainly statistically significantly, longer on answering negative questions if you face higher product market competition. As I mentioned, we do have matched sample analyses for both the tone and the uncertainty stuff, as well as our casting results, and everything holds when we do our matched analysis. And remember, we're matching on underlying cash flow uncertainty, underlying cash flow volatility. That's kind of the measure that we're because we're trying to get at that economic uncertainty that is brought about by competition. As I mentioned, we look at the temporal focus of disclosure, tone, and uncertainty. We hypothesize that if you're going to be doing this, you're not going to be doing this about today's results, because today's results are set. Today's results are there. What you're worried about is product market competition, is future entrants, future people coming to take away your candy. And so if that's the case, we'd expect to see our behavior of disclosure, tone, and uncertainty in future tense sentences. And so we look at only sentences that have future tense, and we find the results hold, specifically for tone and for the uncertainty in the Q&A. We don't find the uncertainty in the management prepared narrative. As I mentioned, we look at word counts, and we see that, again, this idea of the Verrecchia, you disclose less. We see that firms that in the Q&A disclose less, that face higher product market competition, and we find that they script more. And I really like John Campbell's idea here to add one more column where we look at the number of quantitative disclosures, because I do believe that what we'd see is less quantitative disclosures, again, getting at this idea of trying to be more uncertain, to provide less specificity. I like that idea. And then finally, again, as an alternative disclosure attribute, which is BOG, which is a complexity, and a completely alternate channel, which is the 10K, we just wanted to see if whether or not firms with facing high product market competition are more likely to have increasingly complex disclosures. And certainly we, again, find that result. And so ultimately, in conclusion, before I skip over to the last paper here for the last 15 minutes, looks like timing is perfect today. In conclusion, proprietary costs incurred through disclosure appear to be associated with disclosure framing and structure. Specifically, we find that firms are more likely to be more pessimistic, more uncertain, more likely to cast pessimistic, bearish analysts as their call on their Q&A portion of their earnings calls, more likely to spend more time on pessimistic questions of the Q&A, and they're more likely to script and be shorter in their disclosures on earnings conference calls. So ultimately, we believe that this paper contributes to the literature. I'm pretty excited about this paper. I think it's one of those rare papers where you start thinking, okay, if I'm a manager, I put my manager hat on, and I'm looking at that residual message that I'm trying to share in facing high product market competition. It seems as though whatever we throw at this thing, managers seem to follow what I want and what I expect them, what we hypothesize that they will do. So pretty interesting stuff to me anyways. Any other questions before I go on to talk about the other paper that I wanted to share with you today? Any last questions? I'd be happy to take any.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Mara Solomon. I
Hi.
have a question. You focus on the sample of firms that disclose conference calls.
Mhm.
So how you address the self-selection bias problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so ultimately, not everybody does calls. Not everybody does earnings conference calls. And so these are firms that have chosen, for whatever reason, to do calls. And we used to do some kind of PSM. So it's in a footnote somewhere. We used to have, every table you can imagine that we had. We kind of replicated with a PSM analysis. We did a Heckman, and we did a entropy balancing analysis, right? Because those are the things we try to do. But the simple answer to your question is there's no way that we can do that. Unfortunately, we don't have an exogenous shock or an instrument that we can use in our setting to kind of to affect this. Now, the Berks et al. Study, they do a really nice job of this. The Berks et al. Study, they have a really unique banking type setting where they look and they show that, in their setting, that shock is what is associated with changes in disclosure, and we just don't have it. And so ultimately, all I can say is that we believe our results to be not because of the endogenous choice of a firm to disclose versus not disclose, but in terms of analyses, we've done what the literature does in terms of choice, which is a PSM, entropy balancing, and doing a Heckman, and our results are qualitatively similar. But yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It's a problem that we face in the disclosure literature. For those of you who are, again, doctoral students here attending today, anytime you have a choice to do something and one firm chooses to do it, whereas if another firm might not choose to do it, you end up kind of struggling with whether or not that's the explanation for the results you're finding. But that's the best that I can do, is just tell you that we did a PSM, we did entropy balancing, and we did the Heckman, and it seems that our results are robust to those methods, which is controlling for observable characteristics that are associated with, I'm sorry for not being more full. Remember, in table 4, we actually did an analysis of the disclosure to choose or not to disclose. In table 4, we actually have an analysis of earnings call versus not earnings call. And so we use that sample to help us with the Heckman and the other analyses later in terms of the choice decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks very much for your answer. Thank you.
Great question, though. Thank you. Any other questions before I go off to talk about linguistic distance?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Actually, it's a very nice paper. I wonder if you think that there is a need to control for personal characteristics or attribute of managers. This is one. Forgive me if you cover this point or answer this point before.
No, I haven't covered it. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I mean, certainly disclosures are a managerial thing, right? And so, whether the manager, has an MBA or not, whether or not the manager, I don't know, the characteristics of their personality or their tenure or those sorts of things, we've thought about including managers' controls. Honestly, we just haven't done it yet, mainly because if you've ever worked with these conference calls, it's really hard to match a manager up to who she or he is, right? It's hard to find them in the ExecuComp database. It's hard, it's just hard. And so we have not done it. Now, what we have done is, if you look, we do firm fixed effects, which kind of helps a little bit. We could do some manager fixed effects. I'm going to write that down. We could do some manager fixed effects, which we haven't done. But no, we have not done that yet. So thanks for asking that. Good question.
The second point, please. I think there is also an interesting paper about engagement between managers and analysts in earnings conference calls. So you may look at this paper.
Yeah, maybe could you send that paper to, in the interest of time, maybe you could just send that paper to me, and you'll find my email address somewhere, I'm sure. But if you wouldn't mind sending, that'd be great.
Okay, we'll do it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, thanks. All right, so thank you guys for your questions. I'm going to switch over just really quickly. For those of you who came here for the impact of linguistic distance on financial reporting readability on foreign holdings of U.S. stocks, I'm sorry that you only got 9 minutes to talk about this paper, but I'm going to just quickly talk with you about the premise behind this paper and just want to share it with you because I find this paper to be really interesting. This is my first macro paper. As you can see, I like to look at conference calls, and within conference calls, I even like to look at the words, talk about getting micro. This is the most macro paper that I've ever done. So imagine taking all firm 10Ks in 1 year and putting them into one number. That's what we do in this study if you had a chance to look at it. Take all of the 10Ks, we look at their readability, and we come up with an annual readability score for a 10K. So that's kind of the fun thing behind this paper. This paper, basically, we want to know whether or not linguistic distance and financial reporting readability, how readable a disclosure is, whether it influences the foreign investment in U.S. stocks. And potentially, because of those frictions, we also want to look and see then whether or not U.S. treasuries and domestic household consumption are affected by this. Now, obviously, this is the most international presentation that I've ever done. I'm sure we have people from various countries and different regions, and so I thought, what a natural paper to just quickly disclose and talk about when I did this presentation today. If you don't know this, foreign investment is essential to the U.S. security markets. We need foreign dollars in our markets. And about 1/3 of corporate stocks are reportedly owned by foreign investors. And about that same number, about 1/3 of U.S. corporate bonds, not corporate bonds, sorry, U.S. bonds, treasury bonds are owned, U.S. debt is owned by foreign investors as well. And so it turns out that foreign investment can really facilitate growth, lower cost of equity for U.S. firms, and increase growth in the U.S. economy as well. And so what we look at in this paper is how linguistic distance might affect investment in U.S. stocks. And so if you don't know what linguistic distance is simply the distance between English and other languages. Now, most papers, when you look at linguistic distance, tend to, again, go binary. This paper is very similar to the prior paper about disclose, not disclose. A lot of researchers just go binary. Is it the same language as English or not? So if you're in the UK, it's binary. It's one. We're both the same language. If you're someplace else, if you're in Korea, no, it's not. Different language. But what we do in this paper is we measure the distance between English and these different languages, and we just try to see whether or not a measure that's not binary is associated with foreign investment in U.S. stock. And so the best examples I can give here is right up on the board. You can see here the first one says, grazie per essere venuto. I pronounced that poorly. Anybody know what language this is? Anybody want to speak up? What language is that? Anybody know what language that is? Grazie is a hint.
Italian?
That's Italian, that's right, exactly. So yeah, that is Italian, right? Grazie, right? So that is Italian, and so that is 1.5 distances from English. It's not English, right? If it was English, it would be 0. It's 1.5 distances from English. Now, what about the next one? Anybody know the next one?
Sorry, Professor, I didn't understand what you mean by the next one.
What's the next language here? So that the first one was Italian. What's the next language here? Anybody know what that next language is?
I don't see or hear a language. I'm very sorry about that.
My apologies. Am I not sharing? Oh, I see. Are you guys not seeing my screen right now?
No.
We can see actually the slide of conclusion and contribution, which is, to me, they are all English language. That's why I'm getting confused now.
That explains it. See, look how good you guys are. All right, let's try that again. I'm going to try this one more time. There we go. Okay. So,
Professor, before we continue,
yeah.
can I ask something? While
Yeah.
you are collecting the data from the conference calls, which software did you use? Because you cannot do them one by one. For example, did you use NVivo or R, or, for example, how did you decide that that sentence or that wording is pessimistic or optimistic, or it is trying to hide something, or it is trying to disclose something?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah, so going back to the other paper, the reason why we used so simply we collected the conference calls from Seeking Alpha to get your question. What we basically did is we downloaded all of our transcripts from Seeking Alpha using a Python script at the time. Now we've updated that to a JavaScript, but you know, it is what it is. So that's kind of how we did it. And then how we analyzed it is basically we used the bag of words approach, where, you know, we have a list of tone words or uncertainty words, and we're basically looking within a manager's prepared narrative or with an analyst question or a manager's answer to one of the analyst question. And we're basically taking those sections and analyzing them using different methods. In each of my papers, I kind of use a different, like whether it's using Python or whether, you know, it's using Perl, or whether we're using the method that we're using in this paper. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're just basically trying to compare the words that managers use to the list of words. And most generally, you can see the sources that we have. We tend to use Loughran and McDonald's word lists because those have kind of been tried and practiced and used and confirmed for financial reporting. So thanks for your question. I appreciate that. And again, my apologies. I didn't know you guys weren't seeing my screens. I thought you guys were seeing these screens. So can everybody see this? By the way, can everybody see the screen right now? Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
So we're on the right paper. All right, so there we go. So the reason why I was asking is, so the first one is Italian, and so the linguistic distance of Italian is 1.5. The next one is Greek.
Greek.
The Greek is 2.25. The next one is Chinese. You can see the linguistic distance is about 2.58 there. The last one, this was going to be a joke, but nobody, I didn't have time for it. Just if you don't know, that's Klingon. So that's Klingon, and that's not in our sample. We don't have any financial reports, nobody investing from Klingon. And then basically this is, as you guys know, Arabic. Many of you speak Arabic on the call today. And basically, I just wanted to say thank you for coming. And so basically in this study, what we find is that linguistic distance and financial reporting readability appear to affect investment in foreign holdings of US stocks, and that they are associated with the use and the purchase of US treasuries, and they're even associated with this domestic household consumption. And so ultimately, I apologize for not having more time for this study, but this was kind of a fun study to think about, where I could thank you. Let me see if I can't go back here, where I could thank you in Arabic, because I certainly don't speak Arabic. Thank you for coming to my presentation, and just let you know that all of this research that I do in textual analysis, in my opinion, could all be analyzed and supplemented with the idea that a native English speaker and a native speaker of a different foreign language might understand the nuance and the tone and the uncertainty and all those things differently. And so all of those things might affect foreign investments and foreign investors' ability to process conference calls and those things. English is not an easy language to learn, just like Arabic would be a very difficult language for me to learn, or Chinese or Korean or whatever the language is. And so those frictions and those costs might ultimately end up affecting the literature, in my opinion, quite a bit. So if you are interested in doing studies on this, please let me know. I find textual analysis fascinating, especially the idea of textual analysis in an international context. So Thank you so much for your time today. I apologize for going like 30 seconds over my time. But again, thanks for being here. And I hope you have enjoyed my presentation of my paper on product market competition, as well as my brief presentation about how linguistic distance might affect foreign investment in US stocks and in US treasuries. So again, thank you for letting me be here today.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Chris. Thank you for your effort and your contribution. Thank you very much. Is there another questions there? I think that you have done very.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes. You can ask.
Hi. I just wanted to make a comment on the linguistic distance and readability paper, because you've used the bug index, and I was wondering the idea of the bug index, which has some selected complex words, whether that has, I mean, how you thought about it in terms of, if you're looking at an international context, how does the identification of complex words differ between countries?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, yeah, so I mean, obviously, in terms of complexity, we tend to use FOG or BOG, right? Those are the two OGs we use. And the reason why we chose to use BOG in this context is because if you read the Bonsall et al. Paper, right, like they're talking about how the SEC is really trying to allow access to financial reports, really trying to allow readers. And, you know, again, when the SEC thinks, I think they think all readers speak English. I think that's what they think. But anyways, they're trying to allow access to those reports. And so, you know, there really is no, and again, this is kind of what I was talking about, there really is no index where we can measure how difficult it is for a person who comes from, let's say, Korea. I speak Korean. I lived in Korea for a little while. You know, somebody who comes from Korea, you know, how difficult that is to read. There is no measure for that, right? Ultimately, what we do have is how hard it is, the BOG score, how hard it is for an English speaker to process that. And then we have the linguistic distance between Korean and English. That's about all we have. But that's why we chose to use BOG, is just because BOG is, you know, first of all, the data is publicly available, which makes my life way easier. Secondly, it's a paper published in JE, which is a great journal that says, hey, you know, people have difficulties reading more complex reports, and they show some nice results that show that. And so we're just utilizing prior research in our study to do that. But we could have used BOG. But I know of no, unless you can teach me something, I know of no measure that has been adjusted for whether or not somebody comes from a different anthropological, you know, language tree, and how that might affect somebody's ability to read.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, it's an open question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Thank you for asking.
Yes, Chris. Thank you for the presentation. And it's very interesting topics. That's what we need in accounting, because in accounting, we're more doing research based on quantitative. But there is a shortage in paper that doing qualitative. That's the difficulty of the work. Thank you for the presentation. I have another paper which is talking about readability of the financial statements, which was published in 2017. I'm going to send it to you. It may be interesting for you as well.
Please, thank you. I love reading this literature. It's kind of my most recent love. So it's great. Thank you. Please.
No, this is one in 2017.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
I think that you have done very well with answering a lot of questions there, dear Professor Chris. So thank you very much. Indeed, so all that remains for me to say is thank you everyone that joined us today. And I thank you very much for your asking, for your taking the time out to present to us today. Dear Professor Chris, it's been really appreciated.
Thank you so much. Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.